At the end of the war, Germany lay in ruins, defeated and occupied by the victorious Allies. Germany's cities had basically been decimated during the war. Sustained Allied bombing campaigns had reduced most cities, such as Cologne, to piles of rubble and ash, destroying historic buildings, homes, and all the cultural and religious buildings of the city. I got interested in the reconstruction of post-war Germany during my undergraduate degree. Actually, I was living out in Munich at the time, and I had to prepare an oral presentation, and I decided to talk about the local history of Munich, where I was living, and I realised when I did a little bit of research on the city that all the buildings that I had assumed were very old, because they had their blue plaques on proclaiming that they'd been built in 1283, etc., that they actually were very recent additions to the city, and they'd been reconstructed after the Second World War. During the Second World War, cities of Europe were bombed very heavily, both by Allied and Axis powers. And Germany was particularly hard hit, much worse than Britain. For example, about 500,000 people in Germany lost their lives in air raids, and about 7 million people lost their homes. After the Second World War, Germany was divided and unoccupied by the Soviet Union, the USA, Britain and France. The British zone of Germany was the most urbanised, and therefore the most hard hit by the aerial bombardments, so that they really had the greatest challenges to face in terms of reconstruction. Urban reconstruction in Europe bears some similarities to other types of destruction and reconstruction. So, for example, you could look to something like the post-war reconstruction after the Great Fire of London, or the earthquake in Lisbon, or more recent natural disasters like New Orleans or Haiti. But the important thing for reconstruction is the context, and for post-war German cities, the context was one of political and economic instability, material shortages, massive population movements. So all of these things, feed into the context in which reconstruction takes place. And for German cities, they had to cope with the fact that they were occupied as well, and that the occupiers were determining the framework within which reconstruction would take place. At the end of the Second World War, the situation in Germany was critical. Populations who had fled the cities during the war for the countryside, where they could find accommodation and shelter, began to rush back to the cities and to try and find somewhere to live, carrying what remained of their belongings with them. In those same cities, you have the occupation forces in small groups coming in, trying to maintain law and order, restore public services. So really the environment is one of complete and utter chaos, with people moving about and trying to find shelter, and for the occupation forces trying to meet the basic needs of the population, i.e. providing food and shelter, and making sure that they don't succumb to various diseases which were rife in the overcrowded living conditions. The British housing policies were a mixture of short-term measures to deal with the immediate housing problem, and more long-term housing policies which they hoped would increase the available stock of housing, but also the quality of housing in cities. So initially they began with what was called first aid repairs. These were repairs carried out to buildings which had been damaged, but not to a great extent. This was in order to increase the available housing stock as quickly as possible. Between at the end of the war, in the summer of 1945, and around the middle of 1946, they managed to make about 750,000 repairs to the cities of the British zone. And this provided additional housing space for about 1.5 million people. This was an enormous achievement, of course, but the problem was that at the same time there were millions of refugees flowing in from the territories in the east where from which they'd been forcibly expelled. So in terms of tackling the housing deficit, they hadn't really been able to do that. Rather, they'd just been able to maintain the level of housing available to the population. British housing officers drew on the experiences of British housing reforms. So they didn't evaluate German housing problems in their own terms, but they rather used the strategies and policies which already existed in Britain and adapted them to local conditions. One of the things that they did was to try and re-educate German planners and architects and local authorities in the new housing reforms and town and country planning policies. Harold Hinchcliffe Davies was a Liverpool architect who was employed by the Housing and Building branch as a reconstruction officer, and he's quite an important figure because he wanted to make sure that the German architects and planners had access to the latest information and the latest legislation that had been effected in Britain to allow comprehensive urban planning to take place. What he wanted to do was to try and get over this sort of isolation which German planners had found themselves in during the Third Reich and to reconnect them with the international planning networks. One of the ways in which he did this was to spend about £300, which in today's money is about £8,000, on British and American publications. These were things like the Town and Country Planning Act, the New Towns Act, and also published plans for cities like Plymouth, Coventry, Bath, Middlesbrough. He collected these and sent them out to planning departments across the British zone and also to the planning agencies which were in charge of sort of coordinating the reconstruction activities of the various cities. He also arranged for a series of lecture tours and an exhibition which toured the zone, explaining to local authorities and to German planners how reconstruction was being tackled in Britain, in the hope that the German planners would take on some of these ideas and models and incorporate them into their own planning. He also organised a long study visit for some of the key planners in Germany to go over to Britain and to visit the planning departments in London, in Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool, and to have some experience of how these things were working in practice in Britain. This was very useful to German planners, apart from learning about these new reforms and how these comprehensive planning tools worked in practice. They were able to use those models as sort of bargaining chips when they went home to their own country and they were faced with German politicians who were quite resistant to comprehensive planning models which might incur on private property rights and that kind of thing. They were able to point to these working British models and say, this is how it's happening in Britain, this is what works, this is what we'd like here, and that was enormously useful for them to be able to do that. I think one of the images which really sums up the state of that German cities found themselves in 1945 is an aerial image of Cologne, in which the cathedral stands alone in the centre of a almost lunar landscape, like a vision from Sodom and Gomorrah, with just the historic building stock of the centre of Cologne lying in ruins around the virtually undamaged solitary cathedral. I think that is the image which really, for me, sums up what it must have been like for people to find themselves in their city in 1945, to look at the destruction around them and to see what had been lost. Never volunteer to do a podcast or a vodcast, ever.
Right, okay. You might not ask that question then.